To many people outside of San Francisco, or really the state of California, Haight Ashbury was the hippie capital of the world. At its height, in the summer of love in 1967, the neighborhood was crowded with free-spirited, long-haired bohemians preaching, "Make love, not war." Tonight, I'm joined by San Francisco City tour guide Rodney who gives tours of this well-known neighborhood and will show us that the Haight Ashbury neighborhood was more than just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Rodney, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Fred.
So I guess the word hippie, forever linked to the Haight Ashbury neighborhood. Can you tell us how that name came about and where the hippies came from and where they lived?
Well, the hippies kind of start around the author Ken Kesey. He has a group of friends he calls the Merry Band of Pranksters, and he takes part in drug experiments put on by the Department of Defense where they gave people this powerful psychedelic drug, LSD, and he decides, I really like this stuff. This stuff's kind of fun. He steals a whole bunch of LSD, brings it back to his friends, many of whom live in the Haight Ashbury neighborhood, and they start taking LSD regularly, listening to popular music. And they're small in number, but they'll start to attract more people around them. And then the name hippie is believed to have come from a different counterculture group. There were the Beats, who famously lived in North Beach, and they were into jazz and poetry, and they liked smoking pot, but they weren't into the more powerful drugs. And they saw these younger kids who dressed in these really bright clothes and liked different music and different drugs. And they kind of saw them, the Beats called themselves hipsters. And they called these younger kids junior hipsters or hippies as a put down. But the hippies, they don't care. They're like, cool, man, we're hippies. That's not a problem.
That's fascinating because we still use the term hipster nowadays, but it has nothing to do with hippies. How did they all end up in Haight Ashbury?
Well, the Haight Ashbury was an important neighborhood after the 1906 earthquake and fire because most of downtown and the Mission District were destroyed, and there was a lack of housing. A lot of people were living in Golden Gate Park in tents. And in the Haight Ashbury, they start subdividing its Victorian places into multiple units. So there's going to be a lot of housing in the Haight Ashbury to help with the homeless problem. But then over time, San Francisco rebuilds, and the Victorian houses, they're expensive to maintain, and they fall into disrepair. And so it becomes a very affordable neighborhood with a lot of housing. So it'll be the cheapest place for many people to live. It'll be a popular neighborhood with students. The Beats will actually move there from North Beach when North Beach starts getting expensive. And it'll just be kind of an obvious place for the hippies to settle.
This is like late 50s, early 60s, I'm assuming the Beats moved in?
The Beats would have been, early 60s.
Early 60s, okay. That makes sense. And also the counterculture movement. So I know the hippies were promoting it. What exactly was that and what were they promoting?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the parents of these people were the World War II generation, and they'd made all kinds of sacrifices during the war. And then the war ends and they decide, well, we just want to have peace and prosperity and maybe not ask a lot of questions about the status quo. But for these younger folks, there's things that really bother them. There's the Cold War and we came close to having a nuclear missile exchange in the early 60s, Cuban Missile Crisis. There's the civil rights movement going on, and the idea that not everybody gets to vote, not everybody has the same rights. And then most seriously for the hippie group, Vietnam War starts off small under Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. But then in November of 1963, Kennedy is assassinated, replaced by Lyndon Johnson, and the war starts escalating, and these people will be really concerned they're going to have to be serving in a war that they don't believe in.
Yeah, drafted. Okay. Oh. In your tour, you talk about the Diggers. Who were they? And what were they to the neighborhood?
Well, the Diggers were kind of opinion leaders in the neighborhood, but the Diggers in the Haight Ashbury, they decide that it's the use of money that's at the root of a lot of our problems. And they set up on Page Street what they call the free store. And in the free store, if you see something and you like it, they say, well, take it, man. It's yours. It's free. They also have meals they make in the free store because they don't think you should have to pay for that. They have medical students that show up because they think, healthcare is not a privilege. It's a right. The last thing you can get from the Diggers at the free store is a fake ID, and you might think, oh, so they can buy booze, but they don't really care about that. It's more so the young men have an alternative identity to avoid being drafted to serve in Vietnam.
So the free clinic also came out of this, I assumed.
Well, the free clinics Dr. David Smith got his inspiration from those medical students at the Free Store, and he sets up in June of 1967, gets, from the first day it's opened, large numbers of people. Eventually he runs out of money, and he will actually be turning to the musicians of the neighborhood to raise money to keep the free clinic going. Very interesting.
All right. Now, music is a major part of Haight Ashbury. And we've got groups that we've all heard of, just at least I've heard of. Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and then, of course, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and particularly the Grateful Dead. Where did that music scene start and how did it explode?
Well, a lot of those musicians were folk musicians. And of course, in February of 1964, music in the United States will change forever when the Beatles are on Ed Sullivan.
Right.
And a lot of those musicians were trying to get that electric sound of the Beatles into their folk music. And so when we talk about someone like, Janis Joplin, she was a blues singer, but she'll join Big Brother and the Holding Company, which is what we would call a folk rock band, combining electric instruments with folk music. The same is true for Grateful Dead, for Jefferson Airplane. And these people, like the early rock and roll of the 50s, had been kind of boy-girl love songs. But they want to address more adult topics. They're interested in things like the free love that they believe in, the drugs they enjoy taking, and of course, their opposition to the war in Vietnam. And the music industry is going to want to record them, but the music industry wants like really short 1 to 2 minute long songs. And these bands are like, well, our audience, they're all on LSD. They want to dance around for a while. So they want to do longer songs. And because they have other ways of making money, like playing at these places like the Fillmore Auditorium and the Avalon Ballroom, they can make money from their music without recording. And so they'll be able to record on their own terms and kind of push back with the recording industry.
Hence, Bill Graham is involved in all this, I assume.
Bill Graham is a big part of it.
Yeah. When you do your tour, what can you tell us about the Big Five? What I know about is all the amazing psychedelic art for all of these musicians' performances. In fact, I have a couple of posters from the Fillmore from the late 60s. People like Alton Kelly, Rick Griffin, Wes Wilson. What can you tell us about them?
So, we think of the period for its music, but it's also the art that is really an important part of the period, very iconic. They start making these posters to promote the shows at the Fillmore Auditorium and other venues. And it's a very distinctive style, the psychedelic style, also with lettering that's pretty hard to read. And it's so like the square community, they're not going to really understand what these posters are about, but the hippies, they're going to see these and understand this is music for us. And so they'll create this very distinctive style. You can almost call them like the Toulouse-Lautrec's of their period.
Couple more things as we wrap up. What can you tell us about 710 Ashbury, one of the most famous addresses in the area?
Well, I always wrap up my tour at 710 Ashbury, which was the home of the Grateful Dead. They lived there from 1966 to 1968. It was very much a centerpiece of the music scene in San Francisco. But on October the 2nd, 1967, San Francisco police, they had heard there was a lot of drug use going on in that house. They raid the house. And they only find 2 band members inside, but they also find a pound of marijuana and a large quantity of hashish. And so the band members end up getting good legal representation and getting off with $100 fines. But for the band, they realize, like, we have a choice. We either need to cut down on our drug use, or we really can't be living in this neighborhood because we're sitting ducks. And for the Grateful Dead, that was no choice at all. So in March of 1968, the Grateful Dead will move out of 710 Ashbury to places in Marin. The music will keep going. But to me, that's kind of the true end of the Summer of Love, when even the Grateful Dead have left the neighborhood.
Wow. Rodney, we could go on for literally hours. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time, but I really want to thank you for taking us on this wonderfully virtual tour of the Haight Ashbury. If you all are out there interested in more of Rodney's tours, you can look him up online at rodneysftours.com. or take one of his tours or any other tours you can find in the city at sfcityguides.org. Rodney, thanks again.
Thank you, Fred.